if everyone has their video on. I mean, lots of you actually don't have their video on, but I mean, should we have some sort of agreement on what to do about the video, or maybe it's not a problem with this internet speed at all? Ed, you have a view on that?
I don't have a view.
Now you're muted, Ed. I don't hear you.
So I haven't had a problem so far. I suggest that we just proceed and see how things go. And if we need to make some adjustments, we can do that.
Sounds good.
I am recording this. At least I'm planning to record it, and I want to post it when I do. So
good.
What you say may be remembered, or not remembered, at least maybe available to other people.
All right, so we have a rather tight schedule for the 2-hour window, 3 talks. So let's plunge right into it. Our first speaker today is George Rudebusch. I don't see right now on my screen, but he was there a little while ago. So
excuse me, I think we changed the order so that Gabriele could go to bed by his bedtime.
Okay, good. Well, then let's fine with me. So and let's begin with Professor Cornelli, Gabriele Cornelli, who is based at the University of Brasília in Brazil. So I guess we all know him. He's also former president of the International Plato Society, and he's an editor of various journals, the Archai Journal, or Archai, however you want to pronounce that, the Plato Journal, the Plato Studies series with Brill. So we are looking forward to his talk, which will be on, has the title, A Very Beautiful Path, Unity and Multiplicity in Plato's Philebus. There is also a handout, which, I mean, I printed out for myself, so I don't know what you're gonna do just in terms of the procedure. So the sort of target length of the talk would be about 25 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes. And so with 25 minutes, we would have 15 minutes of discussion. The maximum for everything is 40 minutes. So we try to stick to this schedule. Okay, Gabriele, please have a go.
Thank you, Ian, for your chairing. Thank you for being here tonight, everybody. Please allow me, first of all, to express my gratitude to Edward, our amazing IPS president, tireless work at the head of the society, and now in organizing this event, virtual event. Thank you both. So before we were all grounded by this mess we are in, have been in Amazon jungle, and while I was finding my way through the rainforest here, I happened to remember Barker's note in the incipit of a very good paper on the Philebus. Barker said, Philebus 1617a is generally reckoned to be one of the most impenetrable parts of the Platonic jungle. From time to time, intrepid investigators load their backpacks with the very latest in philological and hermeneutic equipment, together with selected remnants of the scholarly gadgetry of earlier generation, and set off to explore it. Many return babbling in unfathomable tongues. I will try to follow Barker's advice on this, to travel in light, and it remains to be seen whether I survive this trip. Said so, I actually don't believe, as many did and still do, I must say, that Philebus must be regarded as a complex dialogue, not to say strange. I would like to refer to a very good paper from my friend Fernando Muniz and George Rudebusch. We are going to hear from him in a minute. They were very successful in proving that the word games and the internal reminiscences in the dialogue seem to point to a very well executed piece of art. Of course, a fairly complex piece of art. Already Grote bitterly complained about this complexity. He said Plato's attempts to discuss ontology and ethics in one and the same piece of reasoning, instead of elucidating both, they only serve to darken both. On the contrary, Pace Grote, I believe that this way of doing philosophy is probably the most Platonic one can find. Plato always combines methodological references with metaphysical statements and ethical assessment. If ever dialogue has sought to intertwine ethics and metaphysics, methodology and philosophy, human and divine life, this is precisely the Philebus. Anyway, I guess we can all agree that Philebus is absolutely central to the reconstruction of Platonic thought itself and its supposed development. In that sense, that it represents, so to speak, Plato's last word that came directly to us about the dialectic which constitutes the very essence of his philosophy. I hope I persuaded you all that this hiking through the forest of the Philebus is definitely worth a try. If I may, I would like to be allowed to press on a little bit on this point. Philebus is certainly one of the most important works of whole ancient philosophy, not only for the contribution it offers to the understanding of Plato's thought, but also for the continuity it allows to establish with the pre-Platonic and post-Platonic thought. On this route of continuity, since quite a long time now, I am myself trying to comprehend possible methodological path which allow to think about the relationship between Pythagoreanism and Platonism. Plato and Pythagorean philosophy constitutes, in fact, a central pivot for any historiography of ancient philosophy. So what I intend to do here is to develop another piece of this historical methodological puzzle of the sources of Plato's thought. This inspiration, so the inspiration for this paper came from Damascius of Damascus, the last Diadochos of the School of Athens. In a note, he spoke of what is derived from the limited and the unlimited, as Plato says in the Philebus, and Philolaus in the books of nature. I can't really pronounce Philolaus in a different way, I'm sorry. So the Philebus and the Pythagorean Philolaus on limited and unlimited. This is the suggestion that I received and I want to go through within the Platonic test. One last introductory remark, if I may. I believe all the effort in order to see to what extent Platon Pythagorizei, Plato Pythagorizes, quoting here the famous adage from Eusebius of Caesarea, makes all sense also and especially in the Philebus. We are at the very core of Plato philosophy here. As Burnett has said, Philebus subject matter, the application of Pythagorean categories to problems of conduct, is precisely that which Plato represents as having always, this is Burnett, always been Socrates' chief interest. So let's go to the Philebus. The dialogue starts right in the middle of an ongoing debate, as you all know. Socrates is disputing if pleasure or intelligence are the good. It is agreed from the beginning that Protarchus, on behalf of the fairly uncooperative Philebus, will be in charge of defending the claim of pleasure. Then Socrates will be making the case for intelligence. But the debate moves almost immediately into a general discussion on one and many, followed by a lengthy digression on dialectics and its method, the first of the passages framing the constitution of things in terms of limit and unlimited. I consider the Philebus' first pages extremely significant, mostly because one can glimpse Plato's ontology in its formative moment. We can see here at play the epistemology of the dialectics as a method, and as a corollary of the inherent ontology. Of course, this is not the only way Plato built his own ontology, but this is a clear way that comes from, you can see this formative moment of a metaphysical, of an ontology argument. But I will dedicate my paper to the third section of the dialogue, pages 16 to 23. This page will reveal that Aristotle, in the end, was right, I guess, to highlight the influence Pythagorean theories had on Plato. These pages show the extent to which Plato regarded his effort to understand the first principle as a continuation of Pythagoreanism, as Aristotle also later pointed out in the famous page of Metaphysics Alpha. Metaphysics Alpha, you know, a critical crossroad for both pre-Socratic and Plato studies. At the same time, the Pythagorean tradition, which I will argue in this paper, Plato preserves with some accuracy is a starting point for his own theoretical project, especially his search for a solution to the problem of the unity and multiplicity of existing things. What I'm trying to do here is a kind of an archaeology of the specific Platonic problem, a problem developed in these pages of the Philebus in a fairly original fashion. I hope it will be possible to conclude not only that we can find general traces of Pythagorean tradition laying behind Plato's text, but maybe something more precise. First, that these traces correspond to a specific test of a specific Pythagorean philosopher. Second, that efforts to Platonize Pythagoreanism are not simply academic trends. Of course, they are also academic trends, but rather can be traced back to Plato himself. No doubt that Pythagorean backgrounds to the onto-epistemology of the Philebus has been discussed by many scholars. We have classic work like the ones by Gosling and Szaif, for example, but it is Burkett, actually, Burkett, who first discussed the importance of page 16c of the Philebus for our understanding of the relationship between Pythagoreanism and Plato, and often follow his lead, arguing very persuasively that central feature of Plato's description of the method of the man of all at the Philebus bear a striking resemblance to what is found in fragments of Philebus. These Philebus pages, these Philebus pages introduce the subject of the dialectics of limited and unlimited. Here, the search for the bigger question of pleasure is developed in terms of the theme of unity and multiplicity as the one and the many, a concern which was shared by many pre-Socratic philosophers. The dramatic character of this theme is underlined by the prologue of this session. There couldn't be a more beautiful way, I'm quoting 16b, that this, which I have already loved, but that often ran away and left me alone with no way out. Socrates says, I'm sorry, someone is opening things here. So we are at the genuine heart of Plato's dialectics. So something happened. Yeah, Socrates says we are here at the genuine heart of.
Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen and I shared the wrong one here. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I can find my way. We are here at the genuine heart of Plato's dialectics, waving the backbone of his ontology and epistemology. Socrates, in a kind of methodological drama here, emerged as someone in love with his beautiful path, hence repeatedly abandoned in the middle of the road, no way forward. No surprise, of course, that the solution to the question comes from afar, both in physical and temporal sense. It is presented as a revelation, as a gift from gods, dosis theon, in 16c, and then as a discovery of the ancients, or iprothen, in 17d. This is the discovery of the simultaneity of limited and unlimited in things that are, and the harmonia between the two as principle of the metaphysical functioning of the reality. And we are finally in the text number 1, a gift from the God to man, so it seemed to me. From a divine place in heaven one day, it was thrown on earth by some Prometheus, along with a blinding glare of fire, and the ancients, who were braver than us and lived closer to the gods, sent us this revelation. That is, that resulting from a unity and multitude of things that be, the things that always be were said and will be said, things that be, the having them by nature limited and unlimited. It is primarily about a gift of epistemological significance, as immediately after it is said to consist in the way the gods point to us that one must learn and teach each other. Who is this Prometheus? What can be said about this ancient that sent us the revelation? And why limit and unlimited are so crucially relevant to deserve to be the object of the revelation? My plan is to answer this question by taking a peek at a few Philebus fragments. But first, a quick note. We don't have time to discuss the authenticity of Philebus' book, okay? We should skip it. Thus begins Philebus' book. The work on nature began with the following statements. Nature, it is text number 2 in your handout, sorry. So the work on nature began with the following statement. Nature in the ordering of the world resulted from the agreement of unlimited and limited things, and so the entire cosmos and all things that are in it. It is the introduction of the terms aperac and peiranonta what particularly draws our attention here. In a search for a definition of thesis and cosmo, of a rationality internal to the nature, Philebus does not claim, as Aristotle got us all used to believe, that all is number, but rather that there is an agreement of unlimited and limited things. There is a terminological detail that deserves to be highlighted here. Philebus does not use the term unlimited or limited, but always only the plural, apera kai peranonta. A more philological faithful translation would be in unlimited and limited things, the latter being the present participle of the verb peiraino. On the other hand, in Plato's Philebus, but also in Aristotle's Metaphysics, the terms are thought and used in the singular. The name Peras for limit, or the passive participle of the verb peirano, peperasmenon, for limited, and the neutral singular adjective Apeiron, preceded by the article to Apeiron, the unlimited, all for them singular. This distinction in quantity could indicate that Philebus will not understand this principle as a metaphysical in a way they will be understood by Plato and then Aristotle. And it's for this exact reason they prefer to use the singular. This is confirmed, I guess, by Philebus fragment 2, which using the same terminology of the agreement and unlimited things of fragment 1, spells out more clearly what should be the reach of this theory. And it's text number 3 in your handout. Of Philebus on the arrangement of the word, necessarily the things that must be all or unlimited or limited, or unlimited or limited at the same time. Limited only, however, or only unlimited, they could not be. Whereas they show clearly things are neither all limited nor all unlimited, of course. Therefore, that from the agreement between the limited and unlimited resulted both the arrangement of the word and how things are in it. And we'll skip the second part. Fragment 2 leaves no doubt that Philebus' limited and unlimited things are attributes of reality itself, not abstract principles, which are separate from the words. This is why the fragment describes limited and unlimited as evident, that is, as manifest in the word. Philebus insists on this 4 times in the same fragment, using terms semantically related to a manifest appearance, phanetai eonta, delon, deloi entois orgais, phaneontai. I have always regarded this natural evidence of the limited and unlimited things as a proof of the originality, authenticity of Philebus' fragment, in the sense that this would hardly be the outcome of a Platonization of Philebus' thought. What matters most, I think, is that acknowledging that Philebus' difference allows us to throw a light to the passage of the Philebus, quoted above, and rethink the way I translated the adverb ae, following some of the translator and commentator. I translated like the things that always be were said and will be said, things that be, they have in them by nature limited and unlimited. This will make the forms the subject matter of the passage, always. Actually, I realized we could alternatively follow Gosling, for example, who translate ae from time to time, and Huffman, who translate in each case. The point is that each time we consider something as existing, we have to assume that it has limit and unlimited in it by nature. In this case, I will shift from being to saying semantically, and will not imply we are already fully immersed in the theory of the eternal form in this line of the dialogue. Gosling, I believe, is right to emphasize that it would be strange to attribute to Pythagoras a doctrine about form if he is the Prometheus, for example. At the same time, it would probably seem quite odd to assign the theory of the forms to oipalaioi, the ancient. The fact is that Philebus looks really not willing to work with the idea of separation of abstract principle from the sensible world, as we saw from the first 2 fragments. And Plato could be simply acknowledging this in Philebus 16c, 9-10, without wanting to jump to the form in the middle of the description of this ancient method. At least I would suggest this would be a more coherent move from him. The plurality and naturalness of the unlimited, limited things, of course, naturalness in the sense of them being attributes of the thesis understood as a real nature, These are also confirmed by the fact that Philebus refused to define or enumerate exactly what realities are limited and what are unlimited. That is, to give a list of limiting principles and unlimited principles, such as water, fire, etc. In fact, in the first part of the fragment 6, he says the following. It's the text number 4 in your handout. On nature and harmony, things are like this. The being of things, which is eternal, and the very nature requires a divine knowledge, not human. Moreover, it would be impossible for any of the things that be were not known for us if there had not been as a groundwork the being of realities that form the order world, that is, the limited and unlimited ones. This is far from being merely an example of epistemic modesty, I would say. Some authors suggested that. Here, the reference to the divine, similarly quite abundant in the pages of the Philebus, presents itself as anti-ionic statements. The definition of the ultimate reality is so beyond the capabilities of human knowledge that it would be more appropriate to content oneself to establish that all realities must have arisen in some way out of limited and unlimited, rather than awkwardly imagine water or air to be archaic as the Union did. If anything is normal, it is the physical world, the reality of visible things. So the path, the method of Philebus is certainly unique, even within the pre-Socratic philosophy. On the one hand, it does not express the monist positions, since being results from a plurality of unlimited and limited. On the other hand, the epistemological skepticism, fragment 6, we just saw, is somehow moderated by the possibility of knowing at least two things: that everything in the world is made up of plurality, and that this plurality is held together, tuned by harmonia. This is precisely harmonia, the tuning, the armochte between the limited and unlimited, that helps explain the common to be of everything. We find the very same concern with the possibility of grasping some knowledge of the plurality between limited and unlimited in the next page of the Philebus, and it's the text number 5. I will just read in the middle of that, because you very well know this page. We must not grant the form of the unlimited to the plurality before we know the exact number of every plurality that lies between the unlimited and the one. This is the core question I want to make a commentary on. Socrates' dialectikos methodos is all about finding the exact number within the plurality, that is his very structure, the akekosminenon of the reality. I'm sure you all are probably already expecting my following move. Yes, we can find in Philebus a similar word for numbers in their relationship with the limited and unlimited. It is the fragment 4, the one that more precisely indicates the role of number in his philosophy. And it's text number 6 in your handout. And really, all things that are known have numbers. Thus, it is not possible that something is thought or known without them. And that's the second part of the fragments, leaves no doubt that what role should be assigned to number. That function is precisely epistemological. Thanks to the fact that reality has a number, it is liable to a numeric description and can be known. So Philebus does not say that reality as such is a number, something Aristotle would say, but that is knowable through numbers. Let's press on a little bit in our comparative endeavor. We saw in Philebus fragment 6, 1a, the first part of fragment 6, that the introduction of the third element, harmony, tuning of the limited and unlimited, makes Philebus start looking for examples of how things are tuned. And in text number 8 in your handout, it's fragment 7, he finds that the fire could be this example. Fire seems to lend itself well to Philebus' explanatory intention. Although fire is a principle unlimited, since it is at the center of the sphere, it is simultaneously limited. It is possible that Philebus' reference to fire as the center of the sphere may explain the Plato use of Promethean reference to introduce Pythagorean theories, the Pythagorean method. However, I must consider this may be simply accidental conceptual assonance. Interestingly enough, Frank the old Frank, notes that precisely this need to provide proof, example of the arguments will be an unequivocal signal that Philebus' fragments were Hellenistic forgery. But well, actually Plato himself does exactly the same thing in the Philebus. In fact, Protarchus, you know, seems unable to even keep up with the sudden metaphysical turn of the argument, throws the towel, and Socrates replies with two clarifying examples. The first one, annoyingly didactic, if I may say, appeals to the phonetics. And of course, the second one, chosen by Socrates, is the musical one, and it's text number 9. He argues that knowing 3 tones, one low, one high, and one intermediate, still does not make us a musical expert. I will skip the quotation, it's very well known to everyone. Of course, so the analysis of music requires careful knowledge of limits, intervals, and correlation between different sounds. This will be knowledge of numbers that constitutes the sound. This knowledge of number in the things is what makes you fit for the job and for the honors that come from a life of intelligence, while the unlimited multitude deprives you of the knowledge. The 2 examples draw on the way in which we can explain reality through an appeal to the web of relationship that constitutes the infinite number of things and the infinite number that is present in each one of them. The discovery of the systematic explanation is attributed to Plato's predecessor, Oiproste. Significantly, the term systemata is used to indicate system of conjunction of interval, which are also called harmonia. In Aristoxenos, the latter term will come to mean exactly musical scale. So, in fact, the most interesting relation between Philebus and Philolaus lies exactly in their discussion of the musical scale. Philolaus, as we saw from the fragment 7 on the central file, is also looking for example. He too, as Socrates, finds especially clarifying to refer to music. In the second part of the fragment 6, he defines the musical scale as a magnitude of agreement, harmonia megathos, in a Pythagorean diatonic scale. It's the text number 10, it's a very nice text. The magnitude of the agreement is formed by the interval of the 4th and the 5th, and so on. The 5th is greater than the 4th, and then all the intervals are very well designed in the fragment. Here, the image of limited and unlimited, as in musical theory, and the example that Plato used in the Philebus, is that of a musical string, continuous and unlimited, in which specified intervals are defined and delimited. On this note, it is definitely worth it to pay attention to a special feature. No, I will skip this part, sorry, because of the time. I'm sorry. I find the evidence arising from comparing Philebus fragments and these Philebus pages, I find them quite compelling. Of course, not everybody agrees with this. Benitez, for example, seeks to deny the connection between the method in the Philebus and any Pythagorean source, recalling that the concept of Apeiron and Peras were widely used in pre-Socratic philosophy in general, and not only in Pythagoreanism. They were used, in fact, but I will follow a statement from the Cominet. Unlike the Pythagoreans, the other pre-Socratic generally give priority to one of these concepts to the detriment of the other, which makes the reference to Pythagoreanism in this passage much more plausible. Here, as well as in Plato's Philebus, the duality is absolutely not reducible. I understand we are not facing the Philebus a generic and vague reference to some oikalumenoi Pythagoreans, but something much more precise than that. It is not just the concept of limits and unlimited that Plato is borrowing from Philolaus, but an entire approach to explaining reality. And I would very much like to quote Karl Uffmann on this. He says, a first crucial feature of the method, as Plato goes on to describe it, is that it is not enough for someone to recognize that each thing has a one and a many, a limit and an unlimited in it, but that philosophical argument, as opposed to sophistic, heuristic arguments, requires us to see the complete number of each thing between the indeterminate and the one. And we saw this is exactly Philolaus' point, not only the Plato one. Of course, Plato starts from it to pursue his own path, away from a normal Socratic physiologist approach, as seemed to emerge from Philolaus' fragments, for example. The first crucial feature of the path, of the method, we could say, is the double Pythagorean concept, limited and limited. And it's this that allows to build up a quite solid ontological foundation for Plato's own double concept, one many. In the sense, and I think this could be understood as a sense of that, is that the action of limiting and unlimiting enables reality to be one and manifold. This ends being a strong statement about the reality of the things that are. And I must say, in my view, an originally Platonic one. So Plato methodology and its deliberate use of the dual principle aims to draw a contrast with a problematic heuristic method. Certain wise men of today, oidenunton anthropoi sophoi, the syntactical construction of the expressions, leave no doubt about the irony of this identification. They merely place one at random, immediately passing to the infinite, and escaping contemporarily from the intermediate reality. Socrates, on the other hand, carefully follows a path, a hodos, the method of dialectics, which will correctly solve the problem of the relation, the unity with the infinite. So, conclusion, because the time is running very fast. This passage from the Philebus central to the definition of dialectics of the limited and limited and the ontology of one and many reveal the Pythagorean roots of the Platonic theory of the principle. As I believe Kant very well argued, we can see here Plato concerned to develop his theory in the direction of natural philosophy. That is to say, in the direction of pre-Socratic cosmology. And it's also Kant who pointed out that this is kind of a reversal of the movement reported, for example, in the Phaedo, but also in the Phaedrus, where Socrates turns away from Anaxagoras in the Phaedo and the science of nature in order to pursue his own method of logoi. These ancient Pythagorean roots are welcomed by Plato in text and then reinterpreted by the Academy, which keeps engaging with the Pythagorean epistemological and metaphysical effort. Although the Pythagoreans are the source of the dialectical arguments in the Philebus, the final argument is the result of the Platonic philosophical outlook. Indeed, in the conclusive summary of the whole argument, you have it in the text number 11, Plato introduced a third element beside the opposition of limited and limited. There is a somewhat mixed, combined thing, the anti-summis gomenon, that originates from both. He has famously a fourth element, the cause, the idea of that mixture. Of course, this last argument is developed entirely within the full scope of Plato theoretical philosophy. The methodological adoption by Plato of pre-Pythagorean doctrines correspond to a first movement, so, of that beautiful path that we have called elsewhere as Platonic mediation or conciliation of Pythagoreanism. In the Philebus, Plato begins with the unlimited, thought by the Pythagoreans to be a spatial and numerical plurality, and transform it into an indefinite quantity, opening the door to the theory of the forms and its indefinite diet. But of course, that's another story, which perhaps we will tell another time. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Gabriele, for the stimulating talk. So we have about 10 minutes maybe for discussion. The way we should proceed, I suggest, is if you go to participants, there is this raise hand function. So just push this raise hand button and then I can see there. I mean, I'm trying to screen because it's really, I have to scroll up and down. So I see William Altman, in fact, who has raised his hand, and then and I'm trying to keep a record. So please, William, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Gabriele. I was very pleased with 2 out of the 3 authorities, Carl and Andrew, who I just think are peerless on this dialogue. I'd like to push back a little bit on your use of Aristotle, though, and in the process of defending him from what I'm going to say. I would also like you to respond to my hypothesis, which is that the reason that there are absolutely no historical allusions in the Philebus is because Socrates is a young man that has not yet gone through the second sailing of the Phaedo, which is why he's so attentive to Anaxagoras, and that far from being the expression of his mature views, that this is an immature Socrates who has not perhaps even yet been Parmenidized. So here's my objection with Aristotle that I'd like you to respond to, which is that the problem, it seems to me, with your attempt to justify Aristotle's claim that it was not Parmenides but Pythagoras who was the great dominating influence on Plato, that in using Philebus to do that, I mean, I admit that you're right, that if it were the case that Plato's big influence was the Pythagoreans, as Aristotle says, that the Philebus would be the place to look for it. But because it's not clear that the good is the separate good that Aristotle regards as distinctly Platonic and attacks in the Nicomachean Ethics, and that in fact we could actually look at the good as defined in the Philebus as much more consistent with Aristotle's views about the embodied good life, it seems to me you've got a real problem of trying to use Philebus to justify Aristotle, whereas Philebus is antithetical to Aristotle's accurate picture of Plato as a guy that separated the idea of the good and did not embody it in a happy human life.
Good. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yes.
Oh yeah, because I moved to my, okay. So thank you, Will. It was both questions were very interesting. So we should maybe meet each other to discuss it lengthily, but I will give you only two brief suggestions. First of all, I agree with you. You can read through the Lexis of the dialogue. Socrates is very young, but you can find but Plato was not young, probably. So Philebus seems something that happened after the Sophist and after the Parmenides. And many colleagues of mine, scholars, could agree in this favor. You can feel there is some, I can feel there is some kind of, maybe not a revision of the problem of the Parmenides, but you have the Parmenides as a background in the Philebus. You can have the Parmenides. You can say that there's a Parmenides. So Plato is old. Socrates is not, but Plato is old. But I agree with you. There is a kind of, we have to try to keep this Lexis thing, this idea of, so the temporality of the dialogue always in mind when you think about that. And the second thing on Aristotle, I was thinking more precisely on the 987b page of the Metaphysics. So I agree with you that on the ethics, we can have a discussion. But what Aristotle says in that specific part, this crossroads of the Metaphysics, it's more likely, so it's coping with a real problem there. And you can find in the Philebus as if Plato was answering Aristotle, saying, no, I agree with you. These are the Pythagoreans. you know what I mean? So, because you can't find this agreement between Plato and Aristotle on this specific theme of Pythagoreans. I can only find it here in the Philebus. Mm-hmm. Is if I can imagine Aristotle and Plato discussing in the Academus Park about that and said, yes, okay, you are right about that. Okay, this I concede you that you are right. But thank you, Will. Thank you.
Okay, we probably have time only for one more question, but we'll see. So Giulia Lombardi.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot, Gabriele. I have 2 points, but maybe the second one should be another in another session. But the first one is about the Apeiron, Perainonton and Apeiron. You notice that in Philolaus we have the plural and the participles. I would ask you something about the fact that there is the present tense and not the Peras Menon, the perfect tense of the accomplishment. And so I would say that maybe this is in line with Philolaus fragment 6, with the reference to something which is in the nature of gods. And so the present tense is the continuity with this idea of ideos of eternity, and not in the quality of accomplishment in the natural reality. I don't know if you think this can be a point.
Thank you very much, Julia. Yes, I think it's a very nice point. Yeah, I think that we can agree that the present means like if something is still happening, in a way, different from the participle. And it's very easy to imagine that I always use this image of the framework. So there is kind of a framework, living thing. So it's happening right now. You can see, and the Peras Menon could mean that you have seen that in a way that you have completed your methodological approach, and now you can see that this happened this way. But it doesn't mean that it is not happening at the same time. So I don't find the temporality here of the verbs like contrasting each other. It's a different point of view in a way.
Yes.
You can see it happening, or you can see something that can explain what is happening now. So this is the way that. But thank you. I should go back to that and think more about it. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, in my view, it is not a difference in temporality, but a difference in the quality, in the aspect. And so this is in your line. Thank you
very much.
And the other point is the continuity of history of philosophy, and maybe we can discuss this another time, but the point is in Philebus 16, when one of the gift, but also the commitment given by the gods to human beings is to scopein, mantanein, and didaskein. And I see in this case a sort of a history of pre-Socratic philosophy and the accomplishment of philosophies as a discipline in Plato's academy. And so Scopein, the Ionians, Mantanein, Pythagoreans, and Parmenides, and then in Athens, this idea of didaskein with sophist, Socrates, and then Plato and Aristotle. But maybe we can discuss another time because it is another point. Thank you so much, Gabriele.
Thank you. It's very persuasive, this idea. Very nice. Thank you.
Okay, well, in view of that, our timeline, we'll have to move on to the next talk. Please unraise your hands, for the next Q&A. Otherwise, I'll get confused. So yeah, thanks again to our speaker and for the discussion. The next speaker in our program is Dr. Xin Liu, who is currently based at Nanjing University in China. She works primarily on Plato and Aristotle, and but her dissertation was actually written in German at the University of Heidelberg, and has appeared as a book with the publisher De Gruyter in 2019. That was a work on Aristotle's metaphysics. So, but today she will be talking to us about Plato, obviously, on Diairesis and Chiasmus, Plato's method of division in the Statesman. Please, Xin, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Professor Harper, can you share the screen? I want to use the PPT.
Okay.
Function.
Can you,
Yes.
you can I have it set up so you can share your screen if you wish. That might be easier.
Ah, very nice. Yes, yes. How can I do this?
Go to share screen. There is this the bottom.
Okay.
In my
Yeah.
Screen.
the little green button on the bottom.
Ah, I see that. Yes. Wait a minute.
Is the document that you want to share, is it up? Is it open?
Yes, it's open.
Yeah, and then it should show in a window. It should show various documents that you can share, and you should click on it, the one that you want to share.
Move it into it. Wait a minute. Can I share the screen? No, I
Okay.
don't know.
Yes, you should be able to.
Wait a minute. Ah, yes. Right, it's okay.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here giving a talk about Diairesis and Chiasmus, Plato's methods of division in the Statesman. This paper or this talk is composed of 5 parts. I would like to speak as quickly as possible to finish it. The first part, Plato's division of constitution. At the end of the Statesman, Plato intends to distinguish the statesman from other citizens in general and from his imitators in particular. In the discussion of different kinds of imitators, Plato spells out the division of constitution because a certain kind of imitator corresponds to a certain kind of constitution. In this division of constitution, it looks like that Plato makes a Diairesis, which I call vertical division. But actually, there are other 2 kinds of divisions, namely horizontal division and cross division are applied by Plato. We will see how it is possible. Initially, Plato divides the constitutions into one, few, many rulers, according to the number of the ruler. And then in terms of quality of the rule, Plato subdivides these 3 types, one, few, many rulers, into legal and illegal. In this way, the constitution with 1 ruler, namely monarchy, is subdivided into kingdom and tyranny, and the constitution with few rulers is subdivided to aristocracy and oligarchy. And the constitution with many rulers is subdivided into 2 types, which share the same name, democracy. It looks like a complex Diairesis. A complex Diairesis means that a dialectical division made by using multiple differentia, like this. But despite appearing to be a complex Diairesis, the division of constitution cannot be a proper valid Diairesis because it does not comply with the fundamental principle of Diairesis. This fundamental principle of Diairesis, Aristotle states the fundamental principle of the Diairesis, obviously in words such that at each state of Diairesis, the one conducting the division must select the subdifferentia that is appropriate differentia derived from the superordinate type. That is, briefly speaking, the subdifferentia of the differentia. The division of constitution cannot be a Diairesis because legal, illegal are not the appropriate subdifferentia of the superordinate type, one, few, many. From Aristotle's perspective, in dividing one, few, many into legal, illegal, Plato could have made a categorical mistake, dividing something quantitative into something qualitative. legal, illegal are not applied to divide the superordinate differentia one through many, but can be used to differentiate the genus constitution. In this way, legal, illegal are not subordinate to, but remain alongside one through many. Therefore, a horizontal structure replaces the vertical structure of diairesis. The division of constitution is conducted actually in the following way. We see that actually Plato makes a horizontal division by dividing constitution into one through many on the one hand, and into legal, illegal on the other hand. There are two pairs of differentia. When the two pairs cross each other, a cross division occurs. By means of this cross division, with the structure of multiples 3 and 2, constitutions are clarified into 6 types. To sum up this section, I would like to say there are 3 kinds of divisions mentioned above, namely vertical division, I call it complex diairesis, horizontal division, and cross division. Vertical division is the type of division in which a genus is divided into differentia, and the differentia is divided into subdifferentia up to a final differentia. For example, an animal is divided into footed, two-footed, split two-footed. A horizontal division is a type of division in which the same genus is divided in parallel into differentia and into parallel differentia. For example, we have seen a constitution is divided into one through many and into legal, illegal. A cross division, as the name notes, a cross division occurs when 2 pairs of differentia cross each other, as the name notes. Yes. In addition, a simple diairesis, namely a simple diairesis is a kind of division in which a genus is divided by using a single pair of differentia. A single diairesis is a fundamental pattern for conducting other kinds of divisions. On the one hand, when 2 or more simple diairesis are ordered in a vertical manner, a vertical division is conducted. On the other hand, when 2 or more simple diairesis are arranged in parallel and stay alongside each other, there is a horizontal division. And then when 2 pairs of differentia cross each other, then a cross division takes place. In the division of constitution, we have thought it is clearly seen. It's obviously that a cross division comes from a horizontal division, and the horizontal division arises from a vertical division, namely complex diairesis. How it is possible? Aristotle gives an theoretical explanation in Category and Topica. To explain the relationship between diairesis, horizontal division, and chiasmus, Aristotle begins by analyzing horizontal division, distinguish between valid and invalid horizontal divisions. The invalid horizontal division cannot constitute any complex diairesis, whereas a valid horizontal division can contrast an ostensible diairesis. In Category 3 and in Topica Alpha 15, Aristotle mentions a division, the same division actually, composed of 2 simple diairesis. In one simple diairesis, animal is divided into walking, flying, and swimming animals. On the one hand, on the other hand, in another simple diairesis, knowledge is divided into theoretical and practical. First of all, to clarify the issue, currently Aristotle characterizes the 2 genera, animal and knowledge, with a technical term, 2 non-subaltern genera. By 2 non-subaltern genera, Aristotle means the 2 genera whereby one does not contain the other. That is, for example, animal and knowledge are neither superordinate nor subordinate to each other, but stay in parallel alongside each other, like this. we can see this is not a valid, not a real horizontal division, but only two simple diairesis that are put together artificially. The two simple diairesis are not associated with each other, actually, as clearly seen in the fact that the two non-subaltern genera, animal and knowledge, cannot be contained by or subordinate to a higher genus, because animal belongs to the category of substance and episteme, and knowledge belongs to the category of relation. There's no higher genus above them. Since the two non-subordinate genera cannot be subordinate to a superordinate genus, it is impossible for this invalid horizontal division to constitute a complex diairesis. As noted, these two non-subordinate genera, animal and episteme, cannot be subordinate to a superordinate genus, so the differentia of animal and the differentia of knowledge differ from each other. On the other hand, the differentia of the two non-subaltern genera can be the same when the two non-subaltern genera are embraced by and subordinate to the same genus. For example, two-footed can be used to divide the same differentia, two-footed, can be used to divide the two non-subaltern genera, namely flying animal and working animal, because flying animal and working animal can be contained by the same higher genera, namely animal. The initial division seems like this, and then we can, since the two non-subaltern genera, working animal and flying animal, are subordinate to the same genus animal, the initial division can constitute a diairesis, like this, in this way. It seems that Aristotle makes a diairesis by dividing animal into working animal and flying animal, and dividing both into two-footed and four-footed. But actually, it is not a proper, valid diairesis, because it is inconsistent with the fundamental principle of diairesis. We have just talked about it. Aristotle obviously realized this problem, so he adds some further explanation. I think this passage is very, very important, very crucial. Obviously, it is not of necessity for the differentia to accompany its own genus, because it is possible for the same differentia to be the differentia of the two non-subaltern genera. But this differentia must accompany all that are superordinate to it, just as two-footed accompanies the flying and the walking, together with accompanying the animal. To explain this passage, I must clarify some technical terms. First of all, two non-subaltern genera correspond coordinate differentia. That means a pair of differentia that is used to divide a genus simultaneously. For example, flying animal, walking animal are non-subaltern genera. Correspondingly, flying, walking are coordinate differentia. A differentia accompanies Apeiron is appropriate genus. That means a differentia must be used to divide its appropriate genus, or an appropriate differentia must be selected and used to divide the genus. That is, the differentia and genus must match each other. Return to our text. As the text notes, two-footed and four-footed can be used to divide the coordinate differentia working flying, when two-footed, four-footed are subordinate to the same genus animal. I should emphasize that two-footed, four-footed should be used to divide all that are superordinate to them. That is, they should be used to divide not only the differentia working flying, but also the genus animal. However, two-footed and four-footed cannot be used to subdivide the working flying, inconsistent with the fundamental principle, diairesis. So they can be only applied to divide the genus animal. Actually, two-footed, four-footed jumped from being used to subdivide working flying to to being used to divide a genus animal. In this way, two-footed, four-footed are not the appropriate subdifferentia hypodiairesis that should be subordinate to walking flying, but tend to be the parallel differentia, IP-diairesis, that remains in parallel alongside the differentia walking flying. Therefore, the genus, the same genus, animal, is divided in parallel into walking flying on the right side and into two-footed, four-footed on the other side. This is a valid horizontal division that is actually conducted by Aristotle in Topica. We can compare Plato's division of constitution with Aristotle's division of animal in Topica. From down top, Plato shows how a horizontal division originates from an ostensible diairesis. Aristotle goes in another way. From down up, Aristotle reveals that how a horizontal division constitutes an ostensible diairesis. In spite of the reverse order, the essence of these two divisions are the same. Aristotle in Topica Theta 6 points out the condition under which a horizontal division can constitute or originate from an ostensible diairesis. There are two conditions actually. First, the same differentia must be applied to divide the coordinate differentia on both sides. Second, these two coordinate differentia must be used to divide the same superordinate genus. Next part, diairesis, horizontal division, and chiasmus. In order to prove the two conditions are universally valid, I would like to cite another example from category 10. It is clear that this division in category applies with two conditions prescribed in Topica. We will see how a chiasmus comes from a horizontal division and how a horizontal division is generated from an ostensible diairesis. In category 10, again, it seems that Aristotle makes a diairetical division by dividing countries into exclusive and inclusive countries and dividing both differentia into the same quasi-ostensible subdifferentia, namely occurrence in a substrate predication of a subject. It's the same story. Like Topica Theta 6. It looks like a diairesis, but actually not, because the ostensible subdifferentia occurrence in a substrate predication of a subject cannot be used to divide the differentia exclusive and inclusive. It is inconsistent with the fundamental principle of diairesis. Because the differentia occurrence in a substrate and predication of a subject shift from being applied to subdivide the exclusive, inclusive to being applied to divide the genus, country, they are not the subdifferentia anymore, but rather parallel differentia of the genus enantium. In this way, once again, a horizontal structure replaces the vertical structure of diairesis. The country enantium is divided actually in parallel into exclusive, inclusive, and into occurrence in a substrate and predication of a subject. The two pairs of differentia cross each other is once again a cross division. Turns out. I make another comparison with I compare once again Plato's division of constitution with Aristotle's division of country. It follows both divisions follow the same pattern actually. So we can see the general scheme of ostensible diairesis like this, and the general scheme of a horizontal division, and the general scheme of a chiasmus. In sum, Aristotle points out the conditions under which a cross division emerges from horizontal division, and a horizontal division originates from an ostensible diairesis. There are three conditions. A horizontal division originates from an ostensible diairesis when an ostensible subdifferentia becomes a parallel differentia, which is not applied to subdivided the differentia, but used to divide the genus. Second, horizontal division, two or more pairs of differentia, the differentia and the parallel differentia are applied to divide the same genus in parallel. This operation causes a horizontal division to occur. When the differentia and the parallel differentia cross each other, a cross division takes place. Next part, from diairesis to chiasmus. As noted, a chiasmus originates from a horizontal division, and the horizontal division can either constitute or originates from an ostensible diairesis. That means actually a chiasmus originates from diairesis through the transition of a horizontal division. It is no coincidence that in classifying animals, Plato and Aristotle perform those divisions that appears to be diairesis, but actually are chiasmus. The reason is that in the biological context, there is only one tagi of making division, namely the genus animal. After dividing the genus animal into the differentia, Plato and Aristotle do not divide the differentia into the subdifferentia, but rather divide the same genus animal into the parallel differentia. In this case, the same genus animal is divided in two pairs of differentia, and the two pairs cross each other, so a cross division occurs. I cite a lot of, there are a lot of examples, both in Plato's dialogue and in Aristotle's, in particular in Aristotle's nature philosophy. I would like to say two examples. First, in Plato's Statesman, in the beginning division of the Statesman, after dividing animate being into gregarious solitary, Plato introduces another pair of differentia, Tom and Wyatt, that are not used to subdivide the differentia, but used to divide the genus and animate beings. In this way, actually, Plato makes a horizontal and cross division, not a diairesis. And another example I would like to see is this. Aristotle seemingly makes a diairesis by dividing animal into walking, flying, swimming, and subdividing walking, flying, swimming into gregarious and solitary, just like what Plato does in Statesman. Apparently, Plato divides constitution into one through many and subdividing one through many into legal, illegal. This parallel argument, parallel quasi-diairesis. But actually, what Plato makes is a horizontal division in which constitution is divided in parallel into one through many and in ego, illegal. Similarly, in Historia Animalium, Aristotle makes also a horizontal division by dividing animal into walking, flying, swimming on the one hand, and into gregarious and solitary on the other hand. In both cases, there are cross division with the same structure of multiples 3 and 2. So very similar. Okay, we arrive eventually at conclusion. In conclusion, there are 3 types of division which Plato and Aristotle acknowledge to be proper and valid: vertical, horizontal, and cross division. Vertical division is a type of division in which a genus is divided into the differentia, and the differentia is further divided into subdifferentia up to a final differentia. Horizontal division is a type of division in which the same genus is divided into parali, into differentia and parali differentia. A cross division occurs when these two pairs of differentia cross each other. The crucial point of my paper of this talk is that a cross division originates from a horizontal division, and the horizontal division emerges from an ostensible vertical division when the same genus is divided in parali into differentia and parali differentia instead of being divided into differentia and subdifferentia. It is, of course, right to make a diairesis. It's of course right to divide animal into footed, two-footed, split two-footed. But faced with the reality of a natural world, it is impossible to divide animal only using the one single line, because certain kind of animal has many different features by nature. Therefore, we must divide animal using many parallel lines. For example, we must divide animal into winged, wingless, horned, hornless, blooded, bloodless, viviparous, oviparous, etc. Moreover, the nature does not prevent the diverse and compatible attributes from overlapping with each other in a certain kind of animal, just as, for example, mankind is both split two-footed and wingless, hornless, blooded, viviparous, etc. It is obviously that the result of horizontal division and chiasmus seems not only more natural, but it is also closer to reality than the result of diairesis. Because horizontal division and chiasmus characterize a species as completely as possible, whereas diairesis characterize mankind with only one feature, for example, footedness, as precisely as possible. Diairesis is prior to us because we first recognize it, use it to define inferior species. But diairesis is posterior by nature because it can merely portray inferior species to a limited extent. In comparison, horizontal and cross division is prior by nature, but posterior to us. I suppose because of this fact, horizontal division and chiasmus have not been known to scholars for such a long time. Yes, I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for this very carefully argued paper, which brings together Plato and Aristotle, and as a bold thesis at the end. So I open discussion. So please raise your hand. I see William Altman's hand up. So please, William. You're muted still. You have to unmute yourself.
Well, this is a wonderful vein of country you're exploring, and obviously, especially the chiasmus. So that's what I want to ask you a little bit more about. You said right at the very end that it hasn't been noted. And of course, that's what you were noting, first in Parmenides and Peras, and now in this paper. And so I guess what I want you to talk about, I mean, I want you to talk about chiasmus, and I want you to talk about why you say it's more natural and closer to us. But I'm wondering if the fact that other people haven't seen it is because it is showing the limitations of the horizontal of the simple diairesis and the ostensible diairesis, especially, that are flawed. In other words, that people haven't seen it because it's an implicit critique of the method that allows us to generate it. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes. Yes.
Well,
thank you very much. Yeah.
Could you talk about that, then? Could you talk about why he's using this chiasmus that others haven't spotted, that has this very unique and original effect?
Yes, thank you very much for mentioning this. It's a very crucial point, actually, to my thesis and to my paper. Actually, the thing is as follows. The name of Chiasmus, Chiastai, is given by Philebus in the commentary on categories, Aristotle's categories. At least, Philebus is fully aware of applying using Chiasmus by Plato, by Aristotle, at least. In categories, there are more than 10 cases, whereby Aristotle uses this method. Okay, this is one hand. On the other hand, cross division. This name is actually given by Baum. He has seen exactly the Chiasmus. Baum calls it cross division, but Baum does not like it because Baum said, okay, cross division like the nature can't split. It's not a good thing. For example, I say, okay, there are two kinds of animals: working animal and flying animal. Okay, or working animal and swimming animal. Both working animals and both working animal and swimming animal could be either two-footed or four-footed. It's a kind of splitting natural kinds. So it's very interesting. Baum sees the Chiasmus, sees the cross division. He gives this a name, but he criticizes it.
Mm.
Yes.
Why does he? So he criticizes it because he doesn't realize its power. In other words,
yes.
what you were saying gives it its power is exactly what he doesn't see.
Yes. For example, such kinds of terminology. Where is that? Some kinds of terminology. Subdifferentia, hypodiairesis, parallel differentia, epidiairesis. I don't invent such kinds of Greek words. Epidiairesis, hypodiairesis. It is actually the vocabulary for Amoius on the Olympiads. It's a very interesting phenomenon. The ancient commentators, all of them, seems to me, they know exactly the Chiasmus. They're using the methods to explain Aristotle and Plato, even, without mentioning the name of this kind of division, Chiastai. It appears only once by Philebus.
But can you just say one last thing? Can you say what habit of mind it is that makes people resistant to chiasmus? What mental conception do they have that makes them resistant to seeing that?
I would like to say it's the same issue with Aristotelian natural philosophy. When we are very frankly faced with the natural world, we must admit there are a lot of different kinds of attributes is contained by one kind of animal. For example, it's another example. Look, Kant make a division. We see that analytical statement a priori. This actually a chiasmus. It's actually a chiasmus. Analytical. Synthetic. Yes, synthetic. On the one hand, on the other hand, a priori, posteriori. Yes. I'm wondering. It's very interesting for me, actually, personally. I'm wondering why so many philosophers, commentators use this method without mentioning, without reflecting on the method. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I didn't see any other raised hands, so thanks again, Xin, for this for your talk.
Thank you.
I guess we are ready to move to the next and last talk on our program today, which will be given by George Rudebusch, the Northern Arizona. I mean, aside from his many other publications, George currently has two monographs up that relate to the Philebus. There is first a book entitled Greek Text with Basic Grammar, I mean, of the Philebus, Plato's Philebus, Greek text with grammar, so goes through the text with basic grammatical explanations. And juxtaposed to that, there is a draft for a commentary, philosophical commentary relating to the Greek text. Both drafts, as George told me, are easily accessible. If you go to his academia.edu webpage, you can also Google just Academia Rudebusch books. So, but this talk today, well, it's also going to be on the Philebus, on 24a to 26d, Peras and Apeiron as scales in measure theory. And you have a PowerPoint presentation, George, right? So are you going to share it or how is it going to work? Yeah, okay, I see it. So good. Well, please have a go.
Thank you so much. For this session of the International Plato Society, sponsored by the APA, I want to especially thank the session organizer, Edward Halper. Ed, you've been wonderful throughout the pandemic, going many, many extra steps to put together a fine program. I'm particularly pleased to be last tonight because my talk, I think, complements the other two. I'd also like to thank you, Jan. You've been a wonderful colleague and co-worker in the vineyards with me for so many years. And I wanted to take this chance to recognize our friendship and collegial work together formally. So thank you both. My paper today will present some texts to interpret. I'll ask the big question. I'll look at some puzzles, and then I'll prepare my own solutions. The texts lie in the Philebus between 23c and 25e, where Plato's Socrates talks about vision, about the more and the less, about the unbounded, to Apeiron, about quantity, about bound, to Peras, and about mix. He begins with the division into 2 or 3 or 4, a passage that Gabriele also referred to. He makes the claim about the more and the less that it cannot end. When an end comes to be, the more and less have come to an end. He also makes the claim that the more and less are in the hotter and colder. He makes the claim that the unbounded contains whatever shows itself becoming more and less. Whatever shows to us that it is becoming more and less. We're not to put all these things into the kind unbounded as into a one. He says quantity is removed by more and less. It removes every trace of quantity. Quantity stops going on, that's its nature. The more and less is always going on. Bound, in contrast to the kind unbounded, contains ratios. Mix, he says, comes from adding proportion or ratios and number to the unbounded. Bound is the kind of the equal and double, and whatever puts a stop to the opposites being at odds with each other. Mix comes from the right association of these things, bounds in heat and cold and other things. Now, the big question about these passages is, what are these three kinds? Unbounded, bound, and mix, that are the results of Socrates' division. The first puzzle is what are kinds and forms. How those terms are used is not clear. It hasn't been clear. And what is the process of division? I won't talk about that in this paper. With my colleague Fernando Muniz, I can refer you to these other co-authored papers. I'm going to focus instead on a couple of other puzzles. What is the unbounded in particular? What kind of thing is it? One way it's been interpreted is as a continuum. There's a problem with that. A continuum is dense. Mathematically, this means between any 2 points on the continuum, there is always a third point. That's just what density is. But density does not fit pleasure, which is one of the unbounded things. For example, in psychology, it's familiar for psychologists to have subjects rate pleasures on a scale of 1 to 9, from very, very unpleasant to very pleasant to very unpleasant to neutral to pleasant to very pleasant to very, very pleasant. If you've ever had the misfortune of being in an emergency room, the doctors there will ask you to rate pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Now here's the problem. There is very little meaning to drawing a distinction between, say, 7.5 and 7 3/4 on such a scale. Right? If the doctor said to you, when you said the pain is about a 7, and he said, is it 7.5? 7 3/4, it doesn't really make much sense. And there's no meaning to an infinite series of such distinctions for pleasure. Density does not fit musical volume. Musicians usually distinguish only about 8 levels of volume. Triple, pianissimo, as quiet as possible. Pianissimo, very quiet. Piano, quiet. Mezzo forte, medium loud. Forte, loud. Fortissimo, very loud. And fortissimo, as loud as possible. There is little meaning for even one additional level, say 2.5 Fs in your musical score. There's no meaning for an infinite series of such distinctions. Density does not fit, this quote is from that passage I read to you above, things that show themselves becoming more and less. This is because there are just noticeable differences in the experience of more and less. A few more distinctions than what we are able to notice is not very meaningful. An infinite number of distinctions is not at all meaningful. So here's my argument against the interpretation of dense continua as the unbounded. As we've seen, there's no text to support the claim that the unbounded possesses density. Again, density, as I've shown, is not a feature of the more and less as it shows itself to us. Thus, a dense continuum has problems as an interpretation. On the other hand, if the continuum is not dense, a non-dense continuum is no more continuous than discrete. A continuum lacking density is unhelpful as an interpretation. Another puzzle is whether the unbounded should be the indefinite, that was Gabriele's term, or the indeterminate. Here's a problem for that interpretation. Philebus praises unbounded pleasure. He says pleasure would not be all good if it were not its nature to be unbounded. Apeiron, in both extent and in being more. Here's my argument against the indeterminate or the indefinite. Philebus is not praising indeterminate pleasure. That's not the feature of pleasure that he's calling out for praise. And therefore the unbounded is not the indeterminate. There's another long-standing puzzle about mix. Plato Socrates says that a moderate temperature is in the kind mix. He seems to say that, while an extreme temperature, like in unseasonably cold or unseasonably warm weather, an extreme temperature isn't. It's the right association of these things in heat and cold that engenders the nature of health. There he has in mind a temperature of 98 Fahrenheit or 37 centigrade. Del Caminet puts the problem very well, but the problem has been recognized since the 1880s. It's hard to see why a bad fever of 41 degrees centigrade would be less perfectly determined or bounded in whatever sense than a good temperature of 37 degrees centigrade. So that's another puzzle. Now let me propose a solution. My solution depends on presentation of scales in measure theory. So I'll take a little time to show these to you. And in increasing order, scales become more and more ordered in measure theory, as you see on this sheet. The ones to notice as we go through are the partial scale, because I'll claim that is the unbounded. And we'll find mix in the kind ratio scale. So let's look at these. A scale is defined in measure theory as a set and a relation defined for its members. Tonight I'm celebrating the Mississippi watershed cities, and let's use the relation close to. So you'll see Minneapolis is close to St. Paul, whereas Memphis is not close to New Orleans. That's a scale. To make a scale pairwise, you need a relation that is anti-symmetric. The relation close to is symmetric. If Minneapolis is close to St. Paul Paul is close to Minneapolis. Anti-symmetric means it can't go that way. The relation preferable is anti-symmetric. If you've been asked by a poll to prefer one thing to another, you're familiar with this relation. And if you're taking a poll of people about what city they preferred in the Mississippi watershed, they might say Memphis is for them preferable to Minneapolis. A claim like that is only true if Minneapolis is not preferable to Memphis. So here you have anti-symmetry. Now to get a partial scale, remember I've underlined this one, this is going to be the unbounded. You need a pairwise scale, that's to say the relation is anti-symmetric, whose relation is transitive. The relation preferable is not necessarily transitive, as pollsters well know. Somebody might say they prefer Memphis to Minneapolis, and they prefer Minneapolis to New Orleans, but they might think Memphis is not preferable to New Orleans. Strange, but this is the way people are. On the other hand, the relation downstream is transitive. Memphis is downstream from St. Louis, as you can see on the map. New Orleans is downstream from Memphis, as you can see. And with a transitive relation, you know with certainty that New Orleans must be downstream from St. Louis. Now we can make the scale more ordered yet if we add to it an equality relation that's defined on the set. An equality relation is defined such that it holds for all the members in the set. If A is equal to B, then B is equal to A, right? It's symmetric. If A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. It's transitive. And given a relation of downstream or whatever it's going to be, if it's neither less than, if A is neither less than B nor B is less than A, then they've got to be equal. That's the key feature of equality. This is a beautiful relation to add to a set. The downstream relation does not have an equality relation. It doesn't meet that last condition of equality. Notice Kansas City is not downstream from St. Paul, and St. Paul is not downstream from Kansas City. Right? They're on different forks of the river. And it's that feature. They're not ordered well enough that you could conclude that Kansas City equals St. Paul. That's false. Unlike downstream, the relation harder will make an ordinal scale. You geologists are familiar with the Mohs hardness scale. Talc is the softest mineral. Diamond is the hardest. You can tell these if you remember from your childhood science class, what can scratch the other one. If it can scratch it, it's harder. This is an ordinal scale. Let these 10 minerals be the set S, let harder be the relation less than. Then equal in hardness will be the equality relation equals. Notice if you have two pieces from your mineral box and neither can scratch the other, then they are equal in hardness. They're pieces of the same kind of mineral. This fulfills that special criterion of equality. Now we can make an ordinal scale fancier if we add to it a binary operation plus and an identity element, call it E. Then we get defined intervals. The Mohs hardness scale has an equality relation, but it lacks a binary operation and an identity element. So that's not an interval scale. Centigrade and Fahrenheit are both interval scales of temperature because each of those has an equality relation and a binary operation. Right? If it gets 20 degrees warmer than 40 degrees, it's 60 degrees. And they each have an identity element 0. There it is in centigrade, and there it is on the Fahrenheit scale. But we can make that fancier still if we provide proportion. And this is a ratio scale or an Archimedean scale. Archimedes proved a theorem about these scales that's fun to look at. Ratio means proportion. Notice centigrade and Fahrenheit scales do not have proportion. 40 degrees is not twice as warm as 20 degrees. There's not a proportion there. So an interval scale is missing the beauty of ratios. But age is a ratio scale. For example, my age, 62 years old, is twice as old as those of you in the audience who are 31. Here's Archimedes' proof. Any such scale will have the same structure as the natural numbers. You're familiar with these from your childhood arithmetic, with the relation less than and equal, the operation plus, and in the case of the natural numbers, the identity element is 0, at least with the operation plus. Ratio scales can be unbounded or bounded. Notice that the natural numbers have a lower bound. It is not the case that there is an x such that x is less than 0. The natural numbers are just the positive numbers. You can throw in 0 to give them their identity element. But the positive and negative integers are unbounded. For any x, there is a y such that y is less than x. Right? Once you have negative numbers, there's no end to less than. It goes on and it goes on forever. After all that background, I can finally give my interpretation. Let me talk about the relations more and less, as Plato, Socrates refer to them. They are inverse. X is more than y if and only if y is less than x. The relations more and less are anti-symmetric. X is more than y if and only if y is not more than x. I take them to be transitive. If x is more than y and y is more than z, x is more than z. And they're unbounded. For any x, there is a y. such that y is more than x. Likewise, the relation less is antisymmetric, transitive, and unbounded. Now I can give you a definition of the kind unbounded. The kind unbounded is a partial scale containing inverse unbounded relations, like more, less, hotter, colder, higher, lower, and faster, slower. Those are all Plato's examples. I can give you a definition now of the kind bound. The kind bound contains equality relations, like equality, and it contains proportions like the ratios 1:1, 1:2, etc. And it contains upper and lower bounds. And I can define now for you the kind mix. A member of the kind mix will be a well-quantified scale. A well-quantified scale is my own term. I mean by that a ratio scale. So it'll have ratios. And it will also have upper and lower bounds that are appropriate for something good. For example, fair as opposed to foul weather, music as opposed to cacophony, or a healthy as opposed to a diseased organism. Those are Plato's examples. Such mixes are produced by members of the fourth kind, cause, but the kind of cause in particular is wisdom, as you know in the Philebus. Plato's Socrates takes pains to show that wisdom belongs to the kind cause. And it produces mix by the right association, the orte koinonia, of members of the kinds, bound and unbounded. Thank you so much. I wanted to stop early so there'd be plenty of time for questions.
Well, yes, thank you, George. I hope that your talk will indeed give us quite a few incentives for a lively discussion. So let me see if anyone's raising their hand here. Don't forget there is this raise your hand function. So let me see. Yes, William Altman.
Well, thank you, George, for your paper. I mean, it kind of follows a little, the question I want to ask follows a little bit from your, the Muniz Rudebusch solution to the great question at 16. And it's, I guess what I would ask you to respond to is the possibility that there is no solution to the problem that you're struggling with because Plato doesn't intend there to be one, and that it relates to the question of the status of one. I mean, when you define natural numbers as anything greater than 0, that's obviously a completely modern definition of a natural number. Plato would say that the natural numbers begin with 2 and that there's nothing less than 2. And of course, that's predicated on a discrete idea of a discrete multitude. In other words, that 1 is a discrete quantity for 2 to contain 2 monads. And of course, at 55, Philebus is going to contain a very clear statement of the discrete monad as a 1 that cannot in any way be possibly many. Whereas, to go back to that passage that you guys wrote your paper on, and many other passages in the line of territory you were just talking about, like the one that just struck me is at 25, where he says something like, "Es ta tu apeirugenos hos est hen de panta tauta tithenai." In other words, it's necessary to put all of these things into one. That's a kind of one that's completely antithetical to a monad that's a discrete quantity. So you got your dense, you got your dense unit, your dense one, but you've also got a discrete one, and that since Plato is juggling back and forth between them in different points of the dialogue, you can't resolve it because they're two antithetical notions that he's playing with simultaneously. So that's my provocative statement as to why the solution especially a solution that's going to involve the ratios, which is going to have that discrete element in it, is incompatible with a whole series of statements where many things become one, which implies that one is a magnitude rather than a discrete and completely atomic entity.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I'm sympathetic to it. Some of what I've done in my talk has been anachronistic, as you've pointed out. The notion of natural numbers, a number line, William, that contains 0 and the positive integers, as you say, is anachronistic. That's correct. Likewise, scales and measure theory are, can you see it on the screen?
Yeah.
I've divided them in a way that's more fine-grained than we see in ancient authors, at least certainly in Plato. I can't speak for Archimedes. That's true, and that's a point that's well taken. I will try to bear that in mind as I revise this talk. Having said that, it still seems to me that the idea of scales is going to be useful. What I said in the paper that I circulated with the talk is that it's helpful to attribute to Plato not a rigorous presentation by contemporary standards of measure theory, but it might be more reasonable to attribute to him the kind of intuitive sense you get of scales that's analogous to a person who hasn't proved that the interior angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees, but who's got that sense. Maybe they've cut out the corners and put them together and seen how it works. That's the kind of notion. And even if it were anachronistic to ascribe proofs or to ascribe these distinctions, which I don't see in Plato, and that might explain, William, why he goes from partial scale. He contrasts that with the ratio scale, and these don't have a place at all in his division, whereas a modern measure theorist would do a 6-part division instead of a 2-part division. Having said that, the things that he says about ratios, this puzzle, for example, why a bad fever of 41 is less perfectly determined than a good temperature of 37, we can give satisfying answers to.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't describe individual temperatures as measures of the kind mix, but scales. Remember, a scale will be a set. And William, again, you're right, a set is anachronistic. I love that. He uses the word domain, and he speaks of the relations inhabiting a domain. He doesn't talk about membership in a set. But there's something helpful in fact, in my paper, my presentation doesn't talk about sets or membership. It does talk about domains and inhabiting domains. And if you keep those two things together on target, then when he says, and this is the text, bound is the kind of the equal and double, and whatever puts a stop to the opposites, I take it that opposites are at odds with each other in the kind unbounded.
Mm-hmm.
So far, so good. That's the kind containing partial scales. I don't see anachronism in that claim. It's a scale that contains more and less. I don't see it anachronistic for us to interpret that as inverse, unbounded pairs of relations. And by putting those in, we produce the kind, we put in members of the kind bound, which contains things like relations that will change the partial scale into a bounded ratio scale. And the bounded ratio scale will be the thing that is a mix. So although you're right about I take your point about anachronism as a mind, help me walk through that minefield, but not as unfriendly to the thesis. Bounds contain the ratios that change partial scales into ratio scales. We can understand that once you have the notion of measure theory and you interpret them that way. whereas a bad fever of 41 and good health of 37 are both finite. If you interpret these passages as about scales, a fever, then you get this very clear interpretation, a fever running unchecked in an organism. I'm sorry if this example is too timely for some of you with friends and family in the situation. A fever running unchecked is in some sense intrinsically unbounded. The organism with its pairwise relations, hotter and colder, is in that sense a partial scale. It fits the definition. And again, it's a friendly amendment. Sets are anachronistic, but let's talk about the domain in which these relations inhabit. It's a friendly adjustment to make.
Thanks.
By contrast, the temperature of a healthy organism is likewise bounded by upper and lower bounds to its hotter and colder. These bounds harmonize the organism's functions. Socrates, and this is consistent with Gabriele's presentation, Socrates, perhaps for Pythagorean reason, Plato-Socrates in this dialogue, supposes evidently that ratios underlie this organ harmony, just as he knows they underlie harmony in music. Right? That's a scientific assumption that he's making. And the healthy organism will be, in this sense, exactly a well-quantified scale. So I want to accept your point about anachronism and make it turn into a friendly amendment. I want to watch out for that. For purposes of exposition, I'll talk about sets and natural numbers plus zero. But when it comes to interpreting the text, I want to be careful to bear in mind your excellent advice. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
I have Karen Shatalov on my list. Next. Karen?
Good evening. Thank you for your paper. I had what I think is a small question, maybe an objection to the way you argued against the density again. You used the two examples, musical loudness and also pleasure and pain, examples that you find also in the dialogue. I just wanted to push back against the way you use those. So for example, you give 8 measures of musical loudness that you find, and the implication seemed to be we can't really distinguish between these two. So you said you can't distinguish really between fortissimo and half another F and fortissimo. But I think we can. It just might take some context. So for example, we have crescendo and decrescendo, and these aren't just switching from one level to another. This is a gradual increase increase or decrease in volume. It takes more masterful hands to do this well for different kinds of instruments. But when it's done, you can tell the difference, and there seems to be a continuum. There's also, I guess, a question about what you're measuring in terms of something like that. So there might be differences in decibel levels, and there's a question about what we're able to sense and distinguish compared to what the loudness actually is. So with pleasure, that's trickier because pleasure seems to be primarily about an experience, although Philebus is investigating this as well. It doesn't seem crazy to me for you to be asked. You're experiencing a level of, you say, about 7, and that sounds like something like, well, it could be somewhere between 7 and 8. I'm not sure I want to leave it at 7. Or similarly, you can have an experience of, say, increasing pain where you just didn't realize how bad the pain can get, and along the way you've been giving these measures because doctors are always asking you know, where is it between 1 and 10? At a certain point, you have to say, either I'm at 12, or it turns out before I was at less, and you sort of multiply the stages at which you've been, the index points at which you've been able to measure pain. So rather than just 10, it turns out something more fine-grained is possible. So sort of by analogy with crescendo and decrescendo with music. So those seemed like reasons to think that maybe the kinds of things that they're concerned with could actually be done.
Thank you. You put that very well. You've given me something to think about as I present this. The experience of a smooth crescendo, just as you say, Karen, is it's an experience of a continuous, not of a discrete stepwise level, right? As you crescendo or decrescendo. And this is tied to the notion of just noticeable differences. There's a famous paradox in preference theory, has to do with the following. Nobody can taste the difference. If you add sugar to your coffee, 1 grain of sugar at a time, nobody can taste the difference between 100 and 101. And if you add the sugar 1 grain at a time, it will seem to be, as you experience it, a smooth increase. It won't seem like a stepwise increase. And the reason why that's the fact that we experience it as a smooth increase in sweetness or a smooth crescendo doesn't show that it, of course, it is a smooth crescendo. It just shows there's just noticeable differences, and that we don't detect the difference at below a certain level. So the fact that our experiences of smoothness doesn't give us grounds to conclude that the thing that's presenting itself to us is a continuum, if that makes sense. You may want to push back a little bit more.
Yes, so I guess I was thinking maybe especially for something like pleasure. So the musical example seems clearer. I'm not sure what reason, given what you just said, I don't know what reason we would have to think that it's either smooth or not smooth, I guess. Our experiences of it being smooth, what would we be measuring if we're not measuring something related to our experience? And then I don't know enough about the decibel scale to understand what that is, or whether that is continuous or non-continuous. And then with pleasure, especially because there's this a question about whether what we're measuring is just our experience, then it seems like, oh, if your experience is of a smooth or of an increasingly fine-grained change, then why shouldn't we think that it is? But yeah. I know Plato.
Thank you.
Plato is especially concerned about this with pleasure.
Yeah, that's a very rich thought, and I think it has to do with the importance of him saying we produce intervals, and we add quantities. And if you think of what happens when you introduce an ordinal scale, like the scale of hardness, you have points on that scale. But even at that level, the terms that I'm using to define the more and the less are not claiming that it's dense or that it's discrete. And I like your point that we don't have evidence from the experience to conclude one way or the other. And again, right, Karen, I'm turning that into a friendly amendment that density and discreteness are not relevant to the description or the definition of the more and less for Plato.
I put myself on the list, and it's actually a follow-up to that discussion. So very briefly, since I have one more contributor on the list, so there is a familiar argument about perceptual qualia or perceptual, perceived qualities that there are minimal differences below which we cannot go. And Karen's argument sort of tries to show that even granting that, we still have sort of an impression that there is a sort of continuous decrease. But that argument aside, I mean, argument that you find in, I believe, Epicurus and then Hume, doesn't Plato, when he talks about hot and cold, talk about objective properties rather than phenomenal qualia? So that would be my question here. And so if he talks about objective properties, then it might be the case that this scale hot cold is actually a dense scale in the way you've defined it, whereas our perceptions of it are not dense. But that would just be a sort of a deficit of our perceptual abilities.
Right. That's an excellent question. It is. You're right. It is a follow-up. Here's the passage. See if we accept this sign of the nature of the unbounded. Whatever shows to us that it is becoming more and less. whatever shows to us, one ought to put all these things into the kind as into a one. So it's got to be something that has the power to show us it is becoming more and less. And this showing itself as becoming more and less, that's where you're referring to how it appears. The thing itself might be discrete, or it might be a dense, continuous, but the way it shows itself, like the example of the crescendo, that sounds smooth and not discrete, that's a different claim about how it's appearing to us than the nature of the thing in itself. And I still want to say, I think your distinction is right, and it's not clear to me, even in this passage, Jan, whether the more and the less is the thing that causes an appearance in our mind, or if it's the thing that is showing itself in our mind, right? It's not quite clear in this passage. But if we take it in your sense, it still seems to the conclusion is that it's not relevant to the more and less what the thing in itself is, discrete or continuous. The relation doesn't depend on that. What defines a partial scale is what makes it more and less, and not density or discreteness. I hope that speaks to your question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I also have Peter Moore on the list, and I think he's the last one who has raised his hand, if I don't overlook anyone.
Hi.
Peter Moore, yeah.
Great. Thanks for your talk. I found it very interesting. And my question is related to the first person question. I think it was Walter, or sorry if I got your name wrong. But anyway, I'm also concerned about the sort of anachronism of using modern measure theory, although I found your distinctions really helpful just in general for trying to think about, what Plato might be doing with the more and the less. But I'm wondering if there's, to get around the anachronism, is there anything, are there resources in the mathematics of Plato's time for similar distinctions that you're drawing using modern measure theory? So I'm thinking of reconstructions of Plato's mathematics and David Fowler's book on the mathematics of Plato's Academy, or Knorr's work on the origins of algebra. They both talk about antipheresis, and antipheresis is a procedure that comes up in the Euclid's Elements, book 7 and book 10, propositions 1 and 2. And so that seems to be a process that gives you something like what you called I think pairwise, or a partial scale, where you just have the alternations of more and less. So if you're doing this process of reciprocal subtraction of magnitudes, you're going to get this alternation of one's going to be less than the remainder from one is going to be less than the other, and then you subtract the remainder from the other, and then the remainder from that one, right? And so that seems to be something analogous to what you're talking about as a sort of partial scale, if I'm getting your term right.
Sounds like a binary operation you're describing.
It's a process of reciprocal subtraction, but of magnitudes. And so in reconstructions of the Theaetetus passage, where there's a mention of the geometry lesson, people sometimes think that what's going on in that passage is actually antipheresis. But so at any rate, you could distinguish that from an antipheresis that terminates, would give you this is what Euclid uses to determine a common measure between two magnitudes. And so that would give you discrete number of some kind. So I don't know, I'm just thinking if those might be resources to think about getting around the sort of problem of the anachronism. But so yeah, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about the ancient mathematics that might be sort of in the background of Plato's mind here.
Oh, thank you. That's a great point. And your reference is something I hadn't thought of, and I see it might help me. Peter, all I was thinking about were the texts that we actually had, and the mathematics that underlie finding intervals and so forth are things that are perhaps in the background, but it's this passage 24a to 26d that I want to put in the foreground of my paper, when he says, so long as the more and less inhabit the hotter and colder, they do not let an end come to be. For when an end comes to be, the more and less have come to an end. to me, I don't need a background theory to interpret that as the end that comes to me as the bounds that are in proper proportion to the domain, whether we're talking about weather, an organism, or lyre sounds. When he says the more and less are always in the hotter and colder, again, we can, this passage of being in the hotter and colder, again, it sounds like you need something like you have in scales, where you have a domain and relations that are in the domain, or described that way. Whereas talk about bound, you need relations abstracted from any domain. And that gives you a sense of this passage. Likewise, he talks about the intensely and mildly. And so these are the passages that I had. And it's on the face of it much easier and just as charitable, in fact, closer to the text to describe this in terms of measure theory than in terms of continua or indefinition or indeterminacy. It maps right onto measure theory once you have it in your tank. Then as a second stage, you might go on and talk about the mathematics of the time, because I just took as a given that Plato had a sense, an intuitive sense of scales, and not a 6-point discrimination that we would get it as I presented it to you, but some sense of the way the roles at intervals and ratios and equality, the role those things play in making a scale better defined, and the role those ratios play in music, and then by extension in science and so forth. That was kind of the thought. Your point, I just see as a wonderful way to extend this exploration. So I thank you for it.
Thank you.
Well, I guess we are reaching the end of our allotted time. Thanks to George, thanks to all of you who participated. Well, I mean, that went, I think, quite well. It takes a little time to get used to meeting via Zoom rather than in some conference hall in San Francisco or wherever. I don't know, Ed, you have some, but it's working. I mean, that's good. Ed, you have some concluding comments? Or
I just want to thank everybody. It was an excellent session, very stimulating, and I'm leaving with more questions, which is good. And I think that it went very well. Thank you all for participating. And thank you, Jan, for sharing. And stay well, everybody. And hope to see you again in person, but if not in person, at least virtually. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gabriele.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.